Okay, so it's 1 minute past, judging by my clock. So let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar today, focused on navigating global business culture and the key strategies for success. For those of you that don't know me, my name is David Wall, and I'm one of the co-founders of Unitera. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two co-presenters who've got real knowledge and experience in this space. So firstly, let me introduce Keith Warburton, the CEO of Global Business Culture. Hi, Keith.
Hi, David. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
No problem. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Merrin Roberts, and Merrin runs our international HR practice at Unitera. How you doing,
Great,
Merrin?
thank you. Thanks for the introduction, David.
Great. So it's going to be a really great conversation today. We've got a lot to cover, and it's a really key topic as we continue to support lots of international businesses in their chosen markets. I'd like to thank also the attendees for joining. We understand and know that everybody is busy running around in their professional lives, so we try to make these webinars as informative and insightful as possible. And this is one of a continuing series of sessions that we run at Unitera, focused on all different aspects of operating internationally. So keep a lookout for any future ones, and hopefully you can join us on those as well. In terms of housekeeping for today's session, we expect the discussion to be about 30 minutes and then 15 minutes Q&A. We're looking to cover the following sort of core topics. So first area is early stage consideration. So this is really around what do you need to think about right out of the gate when your HQ business is looking to go into a new international market. So we'll cover that aspect. Then we're going to talk about growing global operations. And that's really about things like adapting your HQ culture to local markets, and then thinking about the impact of culture in recruitment and onboarding of new employees. And then finally, the next key topic is about embedding culture into the values of your global operation. So things around cultural awareness and making sure that everybody is on the same page when it comes to this important area. So as we work through the discussion today, we're sure that there's going to be questions, and what we'd love you to do is pop them in the chat. You know, we are expecting a high number of attendees today, so we might not get to everybody's questions. So what we will do is we'll follow up with our contact details at the end, and we will be able to address any questions that you might have that we don't cover during the session. So can we go to the next slide? In terms of Unitera, for those of you that don't know us, I just want to spend a minute just focusing and highlighting the areas of work that we do. So Unitera is a UK headquartered business, and we're part of a wider group called the PSSG. And that is a very large UK payroll and HR practice. And then Unitera is the international arm. And Unitera supports roughly about 300 customers today, and we operate in about 70 countries. And typically our usual stakeholder, or the person that we speak to in a HQ business, is either the HR director, the CFO, or the financial controller, or the payroll team. So, you know, we know this space really, really well, and very often culture will come up as an angle to the work we do. But that's why we complement this session today with Keith, because this is his core competency. Keith, if you could just spend a minute just talking us through global business culture and the work you do, and then we'll get into the session.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so just very briefly, Global Business Culture, we are a training and consultancy organization who specialize in the subject of the impact that international cultural differences can have when people work in cross-border environments. So what we look at is how it is and why it is that people from different countries may approach apparently similar business situations, but then come up with differing approaches and differing solutions. And we address this from a number of different ways. So we run very general training sessions, which are aimed at raising people's general awareness of this as a topic and how it impacts on business. We do lots of country-specific training programs, clients who are moving into India or working with China or Germany or wherever. We do a lot of work on the challenges of making global virtual teams work, where you've got, I don't know, a manager in one country, but his team is spread across a number of other jurisdictions. And we do a lot of coaching and mentoring. We've got a big online learning practice, and we get involved in consultancy issues as well with our clients. So in a nutshell, that's what we do, but you'll probably get a better feel for what we do as we go through the conversation.
Perfect. Thanks, Keith. Okay, so let's get started then. So global business culture and the key strategies for success. It's such a huge and important topic. We have to start somewhere, and we only have 45 minutes. So like all good stories, let's start at the beginning. So your HQ business will already have an identity. It'll already have its own culture. So when your organization makes a strategic decision to go international, no doubt senior executives will talk to professional services firms like Unitera. They'll already have identified what markets they might be looking to go into, and they've probably spoken to potential partners as well. But how much focus is actually given to cultural aspects? And that's a really key part of the conversation that I want to start with Keith, because very often, certainly from our perspective, it's overlooked, but I'd love to get Keith's view on it. But before we start, we've just got a quick poll, and I'd love to just get your responses to the poll in terms of this question around culture and the importance of it. So how important is it to develop global culture and the fluency within your organization? So the answers are starting to come in through now. Thank you. Luckily, the answers are important and extremely important. So that's a good start. Okay, and that's nearly everybody that's responded. So in response to the question, it's like everybody feels that it's an extremely important area, and you've got to take this part seriously. So Keith, just going back to the point that I was making earlier, organizations, when they go on this path to internationalize, they will very often speak to professional service providers about legal, tax, all this infrastructure piece. They will, they'll spend a lot of time identifying what markets to go into. But in terms of culture, from your perspective, I'd love to hear, what your experience is of how much emphasis is placed on culture, and then perhaps share with us what are the first things that really you should be looking at. What are the early stage considerations when looking to go international?
Okay, great. So thanks, David. I think just to comment on the answers to that poll question, I think we have to recognize that we've potentially got a bit of a self-selecting audience here, because we have to start with the assumption that everybody who thought this was a good conversation to listen to is somebody that has already decided that cultural issues are important, or else they wouldn't spend the time on this. And whether that is actually reflective of the general marketplace, I would actually question, because I think if I think about our client base and the inquiries that we get, 25%, it's not a scientific percentage that, but about 25% of our clients will come to us and say, oh, we're thinking of opening an operation in India or in China or wherever. What do we need to know in advance of doing that? But I would say 75% of our clients come to us and say, we opened an operation in India or China 2 or 3 years ago, and it's a complete nightmare, and what's gone wrong? So I would say that rather than this being something that on the whole people look at as a proactive thing in advance of their operations moving, I think it's something that they look at when things start to go wrong, when they recognize that there are challenges here which they don't understand. But of course, the problem then, David, is that if you leave it for 2 years and the challenges mount, it's always much more difficult to untangle the problems when they become slightly embedded than it is if you look at it at an early stage.
Yeah. Okay, so that really highlights the importance of actually being proactive at the start, because it's just so difficult to untangle down the line.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I always like to try and emphasize is what cultural awareness is not. And cultural, so there's a school of thought that would say cultural awareness is all about things like how do you give a business card to somebody in Japan? And there is a correct way to give a business card to somebody in Japan. And if you can give your business card correctly, that's great, well done. But I always guarantee to all of our clients that you would never, ever, ever lose a deal in Japan because you inadvertently gave your business card to somebody the incorrect way. The Japanese are not stupid. If they want to do a deal, they'll do a deal. What this topic is not about is all of that superficial stuff. How do you give a business card? Should you shake hands or kiss on the cheek? What this topic is much deeper than that. It's much more profound. What it's really about is what psychology, as a result of my personal cultural background, am I taking into this interaction? And how does that differ from the psychology of the person I'm interacting with, who has a completely different cultural background? And what are the implications of those differences in approach for me, the business, and my clients? And I'd say there's nothing superficial about that. That's extremely profound. And the danger is that people, when they do cultural awareness, think of doing cultural awareness training, they try and focus on the superficial rather than going into the deeper areas, which are really going to have an operational impact on the effectiveness and the efficiency of your business.
So if we look at this the first part of this conversation then, which is early stage considerations, are there any sort of key things that you would be saying are really important to a HQ'd organization that they have to look at in parallel to all of the other things they need to think about whilst going international?
So the basis of what we talk about is that depending on where you're born and where you're raised, that the influences or the programming, if you like, that you go through differs radically from country to country. So the way in which your parents interact with you, the way in which your schooling is delivered, the structure of your university education, and really critically for me, your early days in the working environment, where all of your working habits and patterns tend to get formed. Those influences differ radically from country to country, and that's just a fact. And what you have is you have developed what you could call sets of national characteristics within specific business environments. Now, we have compared and contrasted all kinds of different business cultures all over the world. That's kind of what we do. And whenever you compare two different business cultures, you always find there is a degree of similarity in the way in which things are done in those two countries and the degree of difference in the way in which those two things are done. You never find two countries where everything's exactly the same or two countries where everything's completely different. And our contention, therefore, would be if you're going to start doing a lot of work in a particular country, might it not be a good idea to find out where are your similarities of approach and where are your differences in approach? Because the similarities will be those points of contact where you can build bridges and form better relationships. But the differences equally, or from my perspective, actually more importantly, the differences are where the potential pitfalls and challenges will be found. And if you can isolate those at an early stage, well, at least if they happen, you won't be too surprised. But at best, you can start to work out solutions which will prevent those things from becoming problems in the first place. Because I don't believe that when problems happen which result from cultural difference, which they do every day, we come across them every day in the work we do, I don't think those problems ever happen because people are deliberately trying to be difficult. everybody has goodwill, everybody wants to do a good job. On the whole, these problems arise through a lack of knowledge and a lack of awareness. So the more we can do at an early stage to improve knowledge levels in this area will help to reduce, I'm not convinced you could ever eradicate, but help to reduce the potentially negative impact that cultural differences can bring to an international organization. But just as importantly, help you to start gathering together the benefits that you should be able to get from having a global workforce and all of the diversity of thinking that that should bring to your organization.
Understood.
Just to
Marion, have you got anything to
absolutely,
add?
David. So I think what's really important, particularly from a HR perspective, is when you're looking at globalization and expanding internationally, it's really important to have a clear strategy in place right from the offset. So this is before even going into a new country. It's about ensuring your policies and procedures are going to work on an international basis. It's about having that cultural awareness training, speaking to people like Keith who know this subject through and through. And it also depends on, you need to consider your hiring strategy and your staffing strategy as well for local workforce or global mobility too. And we'll touch base on that shortly, I know, but I think it's really important to have that very clear strategy in place, ensure you have got that proactive approach.
Okay, to summarize then, I think you're both saying that really where from our experience or your respective experiences, where it goes wrong is there's either no or not enough focus on this topic, going into an early stage international expansion. So that's, I think, the key lesson here. So let's move on, because I'm conscious of time. Let's move on to where an organization has actually made the step and they are going to grow their global operations. So let's talk about communication, Keith, and the effectiveness in and around international business. So, we work a lot with US businesses, Unitera and global business culture. How important is communication and that tone of voice when you have international operations, and the impact of that in terms of getting it wrong?
It's critical, isn't it? And that becomes apparent to us because when we run training programs, we put people into groups and say, what challenges do you face when you work with your colleagues in country X or just when you work globally? The number one thing that comes back as a challenge in more or less all the workshops that we run is around communication. And that's, it's not surprising because that's where the interaction is, around communication. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that if communication is difficult, it's because we all speak different languages, and that is the challenge, and I don't deny that, but it's only part of the problem. The problem is much deeper than that. It's not just that we speak different languages, it's also related to the fact that we use language differently. So what is considered very good communication style in one country will often be seen as extremely bad communication style in another country. And so, America has a particular communication style, which is not good or bad. It's just the American communication style, but it's very different than communication style you get in a lot of other countries. It's much more direct, and that direct tone of voice goes down incredibly badly in many parts of the world.
Can you give us an example, Keith? Could you?
Yeah. So one of the American clients we did some work with last year, we were looking at their wanted us to build into the training program that we were running, which is fine. But one of the values they had was, I think you've lost me.
You're breaking up a little, Keith. Okay, we seem to have lost Keith, but just like NASA, we'll carry on and keep going. There he is.
I'm back.
Keith, are you back?
Yeah. I don't know whether we got everybody there. So I was saying that one of our clients, they had this, one of their values was around radical candor. That was the statement of the value. In this organization, we all use radical candor, which is around saying things exactly as they are without fear or favor. That's the way we communicate. But in many countries of the world, that radical candor is just saying to people, we want you to be rude to your colleagues and to us. And in lots of cultures, they just can't do that. The diplomatic approach to communication is so deeply embedded that you can't simply have a value and expect people to follow it. So what will happen is that, okay, those people in India, which is a much more diplomatic culture, they might try very, very hard to be direct. But from an American perspective, it's not direct at all. And then they get appraised badly for not being radically candid. And they think, well, I have been being radically candid. And that can create all kinds of tensions within an organization. So the Americans will say that the people in India are not direct enough. They don't speak their mind. We don't know what they're thinking. The people in India say our American colleagues are rude to us. And that type of emotional response to these differences in communication style can, over time, lead to lots of interpersonal difficulties in a business.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. Merrin, on the kind of the HR side, moving across back to that. So what does it mean in terms of recruitment and onboarding of staff?
That's a really good question. I think one of the primary challenges in that international recruitment process is understanding those cultural differences. So you can't treat every candidate in the same manner, and your approach should be based on the person's culture, where they live, what they expect during the recruitment and hiring. For example, the way that you recruit, interview, hire, manage your employees in the US, it won't be the same in Europe or the Middle East. And it's really important to understand everything from how people operate on a hierarchical scale, because it will affect every aspect of the recruitment process, to understanding, things like how to properly give feedback. Can you give formal feedback or informal feedback? And that will entirely depend on the culture. It also impacts things like job titles. Some cultures will expect a more hierarchical approach to that. Other cultures will expect a more casual approach. Another really important aspect is understanding the legal issues. So finding the right candidate, as many people know, will require balance of the right skills and cultural fit. And assessing for cultural fit can be where things get quite tricky. And it's really, really important that your process leaves room, that if your process leaves room for bias during recruitment, you run the risk of discrimination and other legal claims. So it's something to be really aware of. You don't want to open yourself up for that liability. The other thing I do want to touch on is the potential need for organizations to develop global talent management practices that can identify, develop, retain that top talent in a global context. So this will involve developing the HR practices that can identify the skills and competencies needed for success in different locations and cultures, as well as training programs and development programs that can help those employees develop those skills. You may want to also consider developing mobility programs that allow employees to gain experience working in different locations, which can then in turn help them develop a more global mindset and improve their cross-cultural competencies.
Great. Thanks, Merrin. Keith, I don't know whether you can see the chat, but Curtie's asked a number of questions, and I don't think we'll be able to answer them all today.
I was looking at them, David. I was thinking there's 2 days worth of questions in there, I think, Curtie. Very good. They're all very good questions. So they're all very complex questions.
Yeah. Do you want to try and really would be okay to pick one perhaps? And
let me just so there's two. She's put two things, hasn't she? So yeah, how can you build trust and strong relationships with clients or partners from diverse cultural backgrounds? That's a really good question, I think, and I suppose at the bottom of successful business, it's all about building trust with people. And I think you build trust with people by behaving with them in a way that they can relate to and feel that you are a trustworthy person. But the problem around that is that the things that people do in different cultures in order to develop trust with people differs enormously from country to country. So one of the biggest differences in approach to business globally, if probably from my perspective, the biggest difference in approach to business globally, is that in some cultures, people tend to put business before relationships, whereas in other cultures, people tend to put relationships before business. And what I mean by that, putting it very simply, is that if you put business before relationships, I'll do business with you if your product's right, your price is right, and your delivery is right. But my personal relationship with you is very secondary to those harder, more empiric issues. There are, however, other parts of the world in which people will not do business with you, even if your product's right, your price is right, your delivery is right, until and unless they have determined that you are the type of people that they will be happy and comfortable to do business with in the long run. The relationship must come first, only there might some business follow. And that, by the way, does not mean your product, price, and delivery are not important. They're still critical. It's just that you reach that point later in the cycle. So one of the keys to working out how you build trust around in different parts of the world, a simple starting point is, are they a business focused culture or are they a relationship focused culture? Because the way in which you do it is going to be very different. And just one comment on that, because I know I'm addressing people here who are predominantly from, you know, the States and the UK, etc., and we're on the business side of that. If you look at who's on the relationship side, it's not that many people. It's just the whole of Asia, the whole of the Middle East, the whole of Africa, Southern Europe, South America, and the vast majority of Central and Eastern Europe. So those of us who are on the business side of that equation are very much, from a population perspective at least, in the world minority. And so looking at how you build those relationships in the majority of the world is a critical starting point, I think.
So Keith, and at risk of pronouncing the name incorrectly, in the chat, is it Snetu? Apologies if I've mispronounced that. I don't know if you can see the comments there, Keith, around, you know, just jump in with 10 cultures, hash out some essential elements and kind of get on with it, I think is kind of what the messaging is there. Do you have any thoughts on, you know, just hashing out some essential elements?
Essential elements of what, David? Sorry.
Well, I think the comment is sort of, you know, cultural differences could be like a fluffy area. You're not really getting to the nub of the question, and you know, I think the questioner is around, you know, if you've got a number of cultures, you can't dance around the issue. I think that is. And
yeah, no,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
he or she has clarified. I meant, for example, you know, 7 or 8 different cultures.
Yeah, no. So yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's one of the challenges that we face as an organization. So I always say to people, look, in your organization, if you've got a finance issue, you put it on the table and you thrash it out and you address it. If you've got an IT challenge, you put it on the table and you address it. But you've got these cultural issues, they're obvious and apparent, but you don't want to spend any time or any cash, if I'm honest, addressing these things in a proactive and direct way. And why is that? And I'd say, Snetu, exactly why is that? Why don't people do that? Because it's a really big thing. One of the challenges that we've always faced as an organization is that when you talk about things like cultural awareness, to use your word, David, it sounds very woolly. It's not very hard, but in reality, it is diamond hard. because at the base, business is about the effective interaction of individuals. And if the individuals in the organization are not interfacing effectively and efficiently, that will impact on resource allocation, it will impact on timings of projects and things, and eventually through that whole process it's going to impact on your profitability. And I absolutely definitely believe that greater levels of cultural awareness within an organization can improve your internal efficiencies and therefore your profitability. But it's a really difficult assertion to quantify. It's very difficult to say how much will that improve your profitability. And what we find, Snetu, and the question I'm asked a lot is, how do you start this process within an organization? And my answer, and this just comes from my personal experience of doing this for 20 years or so, is you have to start with the senior leadership. You have to get the senior leadership to buy into and acknowledge that this is an issue that is going to impact on their profitability if it's not addressed. And I think if you can get the senior leadership to buy into that, that's when you get the release of time, it's when you get the release of budget, and it's when you get some sponsorship within the organization. But I don't know why lots of companies don't address it more proactively, other than I think it's just seen as a bit woolly. But
Keith, I do just want to also mention that, of course, this is exactly what your organization does, isn't it? Is talk about the country specific requirements and cultural awareness. So I think exactly what the question is,
yeah,
you get into the nitty gritty and you train people on that rather than kind of a general broad cultural awareness session.
Yeah, we do. And there are three elements to this whole process of developing cultural awareness. The first one is awareness. You have to get people to intellectually buy into the fact that this is going to have a significant commercial impact on the business. When you've got that awareness, people need knowledge. So people say, okay, I accept that we might have to adapt to our clients in country X, but how? In what way? Because one of your clients might be from Brazil and one of them might be from China, and you have to adapt, but presumably you have to adapt in a different way depending whether from Brazil or China, which you do, and that's where you need knowledge. So we build awareness, we also build knowledge, but awareness and knowledge in themselves are not enough either, because the next stage is application. We need to say, okay, we're aware this is an issue now, and we know what some of the problems are. How do we apply that awareness and knowledge to the day-to-day activities of our business? And that's what the type of area that we'll get involved in with our clients, taking them through that three-stage process. Some of our clients stop at stage 2, unfortunately, but it's the application piece which is really important. We have identified that there is a significant difference of approach to agile project methodology in America and India. What are we going to do about that? How can we bring ourselves together so we've got a common approach which is going to work much more successfully?
Yeah,
that's
I'm
what
conscious
we,
of time,
Keith.
do. I'm conscious of time.
Yep.
And I just want to round off this question from Snetu, and apologies again if I've mispronounced the name. I do wonder whether it's actually upper level, and it might be something that you could take offline. I think the question might be around, but I'm not sure. If you have a challenge with let's say a German employee, how do you deal with it versus a problem with a Chinese employee versus a Spanish employee, right? And it might be just is there some 101 things that you have to sort of think about before you engage in that conversation? I don't propose you answer the question now, but it might be that is the direction of questioning in the chat.
So the examples you used, Germany, China, and I can't remember the other one. Each of those countries has a reasonably well-defined approach to business. And so if you're addressing somebody from that country, and you've got a problem with somebody from that country, first of all, you need to have the knowledge to know is that a problem that is caused by personality? Is that a problem which is caused by that person just not being particularly good at their job? Or is that problem actually a cultural difference? And that from their perspective, there is no problem there because they're doing everything perfectly. And to be able to make that call, you need, it's what I was going back to, you need knowledge. You need that knowledge. And unfortunately, lots of people don't have that level of knowledge, and they need to build it.
Yeah.
But what you can't do, and I think Marion alluded to this, is you can't just go in and have the same approach to all three members of staff, because their expectations and their approach will be significantly different. And that's where you start to get into the issue of the challenges of having global appraisal systems and all of those types of things that we get involved in with our clients on a consultancy basis.
So Ritika, sorry, apologies, has asked a good question. Any problem which is very common and faced by almost all countries while working with each other? Is there any, obvious things, or is it just a mishmash of loads of different?
It is a bit of a mishmash.
Yeah.
It is a bit of a mishmash, but if you were to say to me what's the biggest thing, I'd go back to what I talked about before, which is communication.
Yeah.
That there are massively different communication styles around the world, and those cause lots of misunderstandings, which trigger other problems. So addressing communication, I think, is a pretty critical thing. Okay,
perfect. Conscious of time, I want to move to the last phase now, which is about embedding culture and the cultural values into the global organization. So I think I'd like to have a short conversation around, how do organizations ensure cultural awareness message is adopted throughout the business, Keith? So they've gone from that, let's set up in a new international location. They've done that. They've then started to get their processes and procedures, on the HR side in line, and then operationally they're starting working together. But how do they ensure that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of, that cultural message across the global piece?
Yeah, so this is where your company culture becomes so critical, because you will never make Americans into Indians, nor would you ever want to, and you'll never make Indians into Americans, nor would you ever want to. But there has to be a common approach, because there might also be China in the mix, there might be Germany in the mix, there might be Brazil in the mix. So everybody cannot be constantly adapting to everybody all the time. It's just too complicated. And that's where you need to have a very strong company culture. And you say the way in which we address this, it's not the American way, it's not the Indian way, it's our company way. And what you have to be very careful about there, though, is that you don't just make your company culture a mirror image of your country culture. So if the decision-making style that we have in our company is just a complete mirror of what we do in HQ, then that is seen as 21st century colonialism rather than having a common approach. So one of the things I would always say to our clients when they're in the globalizing process is revisit your company values. Are your values, which you set up when you started your business and have served you really well up to this point, are they right still now that you're going global? Is radical candor really a value that you can have globally when probably more than 50% of the world are on the diplomatic, not the direct side? Is that something you can continue into the future? So you need to look at developing a set of values which are understandable by everybody in the organization. And you need to look at a company culture in terms of common processes that everybody understands and everybody buys into. And that needs very, very careful rollout, because people won't necessarily get everything immediately. Everything needs explaining.
Marina, do you have any comments from the HR side on this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, exactly what Keith says, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I think what you need to be really aware from a HR perspective is that though, you know, many companies are looking to kind of standardize, one thing will always be inherently different aside from culture, and that is local labour and employment laws. And organisations need to be really careful on that, and that particularly relates to policies and procedures. Is you can't do one global handbook and expect that to fit every culture and every country. It's just not going to work. You're going to open yourself up for liability. You're going to end up with unhappy employees and potentially a very high retention rate. So it's something to be really mindful of. And the other piece I really like to make organisations aware of is how that then impacts on diversity and inclusion, which is obviously a big part of the HR message at the moment. As you're expanding internationally and globally, you need to be developing those international HR policies that can effectively manage a diverse and inclusive workforce. So that will involve developing the policies and practices that are sensitive to those cultural, ethnic and linguistic backgrounds of those employees, and creates that culture that values the diversity and inclusion and provides your employees with that sense of engagement. And for me, that's a very, very important piece of your global expansion.
Great, thanks, Maren. Stephanie's asked one question. Unfortunately, we've got 3 minutes to address that, and it's what conflicts from a communication perspective do we expect from the up-and-coming G20? I think, Stephanie, if we could solve that in the next 3 minutes, the world would be a better place, and I'm not sure we're going to get there. But happy to pick it up offline. Listen, it's been a really good session from our perspective. I can see the attendee numbers, and we've had nobody drop off. So thank you, Keith and Merrin, for your contributions today. And thank you for everybody that's participated in the chat and for those that have listened. I do hope that it's been useful, insightful. Obviously, it's a huge topic, and you know there's plenty that we haven't managed to get into. But the purpose of this is to try and educate and provide, you know, share experiences. But you know, we are here, Unitera, to help your organisations grow internationally. And Keith's organisation is there to really provide support on the global culture side. So we will follow up with you all in terms of a follow-up message around, you know, if you want to get in contact with us. My email is david@unitera.io. Merrin, what's your email?
Merrin, that's MERRYN @unitera.io.
Great. And Keith, just to round us off, email please.
Keith@globalbusinessculture.com.
Super. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. I wish you a pleasant rest of the week, and keep an eye out for our future webinars and sessions, and all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.